Welcome back, my friends. We are now on Chapter 7 of the Saints of Snowville. Let's get started. Peter Stevenson's funeral was held on a cold afternoon in February 1933. There was 4 feet of snow on the ground, and the temperature had warmed up to 30 degrees below zero, from 45 below the night before. Peter had died 3 days before of pneumonia. We have assembled this afternoon to pay our last respects to a pioneer of this community. Bishop Jackson had begun the service at 1:30 p.m. Brother Peter Stevenson leaves a large and devoted family to mourn his untimely death. The ward choir will be singing "Sometime We'll Understand," after which Susan Jensen will read the obituary. After a somewhat tearful rendition of the traditional dirge, Susan, the youngest daughter of Peter and his late wife, Margaret, stood up. She was a pale, flat-chested woman who spoke in a low, halting voice. Muffling a few sobs, she began. Peter Hans Stevenson was born in Copenhagen, Denmark on June 30th, 1861. He joined the church at the age of 13 and immigrated to the United States in 1874. Peter Stevenson was married to Mary Swenson, who survives him. Margaret Swenson, who died in 1915, and Mary Nilsson, who survives him. He is the father of 24 children, 16 of whom survive. Peter Stevenson has served a Republican precinct committeeman, road maintainer, and constable. As a young man, he served as secretary of the priest's quorum. He also served as superintendent of the Sunday school, and later as second counselor in the ward bishopric. He had a hard life, and he was devoted husband and father. Susan's conclusion was a eulogy to Peter as pioneer, community leader, and servant of God. Counselor Fred Calvert looked down from the stand in the mourners section and said under his breath, "Old Pete had a hard life, all right, but the hardest part was keeping his mind off women. Only part of his story will be told here." Fred looked at the 13 children present at the funeral service. Among them were 6 feeble-minded, 3 from the family of Mary Nelson, 2 from the family of Mary Swenson, and 1 from the family of Margaret Swenson. The 8 children who had died were normal, while all the feeble-minded children lived. Peter's 2 living widows, Mary Nelson, who spoke less than 100 words of English, and Mary Swenson, the oldest of wives, were in the audience. Mary Swenson took great satisfaction in the fact that she had outlived Peter and her sister Margaret, both of whom she had learned to hate. Peter Stevenson had married Mary Swenson, aged 20, and Margaret Swenson, aged 17, in the Logan Temple, the same day in 1886. He had to the Swenson homestead courting Margaret, but Mary was an old maid, and her father was determined she would be part of the package deal. If Peter wanted to marry the younger daughter, old Lars Swenson apparently got this idea from the biblical story of Jacob and his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, who were sisters. Including Mary did not appeal to Peter at all. He had his eye on Margaret since she was 15, but Mary did absolutely nothing for him. She was a big-breasted, big-hipped blonde who worked in the fields like a ranch hand. Margaret was slim and had the palest blue eyes he had ever seen, and she worked in the house, except when she occasionally helped him with the milking. Peter and Lars could not come to terms for more than a year. When it was finally decided that Peter would marry them both the same day, it did not make anyone particularly happy, but it was a solution. Peter really couldn't afford to enter into the polygamous marriage. He had a 120-acre homestead, 10 milk cows, and was in debt. The trip from Snowville to Logan, 50 miles away, took a day and a half by buggy. The groom, the 2 brides, and members of both families rode to the wedding in 2 buggies. After the ceremony, arrangements were made for Peter and his wives to stay on their wedding night with Aunt Lizzie Jensen, an old maid who taught school in Logan at Brigham Young College. The other members of the party were farmed out to other relatives. The new brides were assigned bedrooms side by side. Peter was to be a sire at large, free to service whom he would. After they were settled, the relatives left the newlyweds to solve their own problems. By reason of age, Mary had some claim to be the first to terminate her virginity. On the other hand, Peter's preference was well known, and he liked likely would have the final word. It was a foregone conclusion that Margaret was destined to spend more time in Peter's bed, but she was not inclined to begin her marriage by knuckling under to Mary on her wedding night. No one ever found out for sure what happened that night. The topic was discussed for many years in Snowville, no one ever coming up with any detailed factual information. Plural marriages were commonplace. Marriages to two sisters were not uncommon, but marriage to two women on the same day was almost unheard of. In subsequent discussions among the ladies in the Relief Society meetings, both Margaret and Mary claimed to have been first in the marital bed, but they gave few details. The consensus among the ladies was that Mary was the less convincing. Peter was not inclined to talk about this in much detail, as most men, about his feats in the bed, but on one occasion, 5 or 6 years later, he told frightening companions that he had occupied Margaret 5 times that night. The young men marveled, while the older men said Pete was a goddamn liar. When asked if he visited Mary's bed, Peter was evasive. On one occasion, he said, "Sure." On another occasion, he said, "What do you think?" On still another occasion, he said, "Just once." On Peter's wedding night, Aunt Lizzie, her bed having been preempted, made a bed on the couch in the front room near the bedrooms. Of course, she didn't sleep a wink during the night. It was reported that Lizzie said later she heard someone crying during the night, and at one time heard someone pound on the wall or door and call Peter's name. Aunt Lizzie further said that at breakfast the next morning Mary's eyes were swollen and red, and she hardly said a word. Margaret's face was flushed, but she was happy. Peter was solemn as usual, but appeared to be pleased with himself. Lizzie made the beds, but what she saw or didn't see wouldn't mean much to an old maid. Considering all the evidence and knowing the background, the jury composed of the saints of Snowville concluded that on the wedding night Peter never left Margaret's room, and that Mary sobbed most of the night as she listened through the paper-thin wall to the activities transpiring in the adjoining room. Mary took great satisfaction in the fact that she became pregnant first, but this satisfaction was short-lived because she bore an idiot son. Returning to Snowville, Peter built 2 identical 3-room log cabins with 1/8 of a mile apart and put a wife in each one. They proceeded to bear children, as was their calling. Peter stayed with each wife 2 weeks at a time. However, during his 2-week stay with Mary, he was frequently seen at the neighbors going over to Margaret's house late at night. It annoyed Mary, but she didn't want to draw further public attention to it by complaining to anyone except Peter. As soon as Mary became pregnant, Peter stopped sleeping with her. Mary was heard to complain about this, but Peter reminded her that their marriage was one of convenience, and he saw no reason to spill his seed. But everyone noted that he didn't leave Margaret's bed when she became pregnant until she was in her 7th month. The United States Marshals were so busy rounding up the Utah polygamists that they didn't get around to Idaho lawbreakers until 1888. By that time, each of Peter Stevenson's 2 wives had borne him child, and each was pregnant again. And in material matters and posterity, Peter was prospering when the Marshals came to town and spoiled things. Besides Peter, 2 other men in Snowville were openly living in polygamy. David Thomas had come to town a year before with 3 wives. He had left Richmond, Utah. When the Marshals made it too hot, his brother Lawrence and 2 wives had gone to Canada, and a cousin with 3 wives wound up in Mexico. Eldon Richards had 2 wives, was senile, and had lived in Snowville since 1875. Several others had an additional wife, but did not live with her openly. Most of the time the extra wife still lived with her parents and was exposed only occasionally to her husband to be bred. One day in the Snowville townspeople were warned that the Marshals were in Paris, 8 miles away, rounding up polygamists. David Thomas said he would run no more, and that what happened to him was up to the Lord. He was arrested and sent to spend 2 years in the Ruger Clausen, a member of the Council of the 12 in the federal penitentiary. Eldon Richards promised the marshal that he would live with only 1 wife. He kept his word until the Marshals went back to Salt Lake City. Brother Stevenson took to the hills, escaping from the town under the load of hay. When he got to Fish Haven, he borrowed a horse and rode along the foothills. He stayed one night in Laketown, Utah, then went to Evanston, Wyoming, where he spent the next 4 months. He came back to Snowville in the middle of the night, when all appeared to be safe. Soon the stake president learned that there was a warrant out for the arrest of Peter Stevenson. It seemed that David Thomas didn't feel he should be in jail in involuntary celibacy, while Peter Stevenson was freely visiting both of his young wives, and David talked. Since the marshals were expected to return and finish last year's work as soon as the spring came, the church officials decided to send Peter on a mission. In March of 1889, Elder Peter Stevenson was on his way to Denmark to serve a mission. In the summer of 1891 he returned, bringing with him 150 immigrant converts to settle in Zion. Among these immigrants were Mary Nelson, a 16-year-old orphan whom Peter had resolved to take as his wife. She was a plain girl with legs like stovepipes, but after 2 years away from the marriage bed, any female, legs or no legs, looked good to him. His plan for a third wife was not without complications. The manifesto had been announced in 1890. The marshals had agreed to leave the polygamists alone, but would not condone any more plural marriages. Some of those young brethren in the church were disappointed, as they had been looking forward to more than one wife. They reasoned with the first presidency that many of the old men in the church had enjoyed from 2 to 15 wives for 40 years. Now that they were too old for pleasures of the bed, they were perfectly willing that polygamy should come to an end. The argument was not without merit, nor did it fall on deaf ears. The general authorities relented somewhat and declared that any brother who had planned a plural marriage before the manifesto could go ahead with it. This opened the floodgates. Plural marriages were performed even 7 or 8 years after the manifesto. Girls who were 10 years old at the time of the manifesto were taken as a second or third wives. Peter Stevenson lied, but invoked the exception and married Mary Nelson, whom he had met for the first time a year after the manifesto. It was necessary to go to Manti, Utah to be married, as the brethren in Manti were a little more broad-minded and under less pressure from the federal marshals. The saints of Snowville said that heaven did not smile on Peter's marriage to Mary Nelson. She bore him 2 idiot sons who grew to adults, Lehi and Nephi, one normal son who died of the flu in 1918, and a feeble-minded nymphomaniac daughter, Sarah. Sarah's passion for men would not be stilled. Although she had many throughout the years, God was merciful. Sarah was barren, and her kind was not perpetuated. Mary Nelson Stevenson lived in a third three-room log cabin, 1/8 of a mile from the others, for nearly 40 years. She endured physical hardships and many indignities, and to the end of her days with a nostalgia for Denmark and a hatred of polygamy. The funeral was a typical Mormon service for the dead, lasting more than 2 hours. Speakers were Bishop Jackson, Jared Perry, Albert Nelson, and former stake president Whitney. Each talked too long about many of the same subjects. Former President Whitney did keep everyone awake, however, in his vigorous years. He was well versed in the interesting speaker. Since his release as stake president, his mind had rapidly deteriorated. He sometimes forgot the occasion at which he was speaking. In the Stevenson funeral, he told some jokes. The first joke produced a startled reaction from those in attendance. The second joke produced a slight ripple of mirth. The last joke resulted in boisterous outbursts from Nephi Stevenson, the least endowed of Peter's children. Whitney purported to illustrate a point with his third story. A young boy ran down in the field where his father was plowing and said that a preacher was at the house and would like to talk. The father asked which preacher it was. The boy said he didn't know. The father then directed the boy to run back to the house and gave him the following instructions. If the preacher is a Catholic priest, hide the whiskey so he won't drink it. If he is a Methodist minister, put the fried chicken away so he can't find it. If he is a Mormon bishop, sit on your mother's lap until I get there. No one could ever figure out what point poor old President Whitney thought he was making with this story. The bishop realized that Whitney had entirely missed the point of the story. He later said that, in Whitney's defense, To the pure all things are pure, and to those who are defiled nothing is pure. The funeral finally closed with another traditional hymn, Beyond the Sunset. A tone poem was added by Mary Jackson, the bishop's wife, designed to produce a flood of tears, which it did. Before the service, members of the family appeared to be calm, but after 2 hours of emotional torture, some were hysterical, and all were completely worn out. All, that is, but Mary Swenson Stevenson, who stood dry-eyed and listened with satisfaction at the first clumps of frozen dirt hit the casket.